So decoupling is like a dismemberment of the body. And in the sense of, particularly for the multinational corporations, the leading 10,000 companies that are out there in that touch the supply chain, everything that they do is going to somehow be connected to China. And for those with, let's say, a little bit better understanding, but still sort of a sophomoric understanding of what's happening in the supply chain, what we'll see is that if we look at the headline number, we'll see that Vietnam now is a much bigger trading partner with the United States. But that number is like 70% of it is inputs coming from China. So there's still, it's almost impossible to completely decouple, except if you have a CFO who will say, okay, I'll take the 20% increase in price and I'll put, I'll source it in Mexico, or I'll source it in Hungary, or I'll source it in Slovakia, whatever. China is separated by 100 miles of water. There are only about 14 beaches in Taiwan that are accessible and where they could land. And they basically need to get 1 million soldiers across the straits in order to occupy Taiwan. Now, the blockade creates all kinds of problems from a military perspective. If you take a look at what the Ukrainians have been able to do to decimate the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, it's obvious that simple jet ski drones are very difficult to defend against. And Taiwan is much more sophisticated in terms of their capabilities to pump out drones. The US, again, is supporting them. The Japanese are supporting them. The Filipinos are supporting them. I think it really depends upon the US response. And in a lot of ways, the US and the Japanese response to this, what do they do? The Japanese have a formidable military capability. We have bases, in Okinawa. I think the US has been on a forward deployment of munitions for a while now. God knows what we've already given the Taiwanese that we haven't said publicly. So I don't know, Xi Jinping said recently that we're not stupid enough to get tricked into attacking Taiwan.
Oh, that's interesting positioning.
Yeah.
That's a saving face move if I ever saw one. Hello, and welcome to Fireside with the VC. My name is Andrew Romans, and today we're with Francis Bassolino, who is the Managing Director of Alaris Consulting based in Shanghai, China. And Francis was introduced to me from an old friend I used to work with who was in China back then. And I guess Francis was too. And so he's just spent decades and decades doing business at all senior levels in China and across China with partners from around the globe. So he brings a fascinating set of real world experience with primary source information, not whatever the parroting media is saying. And so I'd like to get in, Francis, today into maybe a couple different parts discussion. One is, maybe rapidly bring us through the history of Westerners doing business in China, Chinese doing business outside of China with success. So let's focus on the successes. And then what has changed? And, I've been to China, as I was just telling you, a couple, 20 plus times. There's certainly an infectious vibe of intoxicating opportunity when you're around these people, not to mention their place. But, certainly since the kind of combative Trump days, or maybe some unfair, unilateral agreements that were in place, what's the future and where are we heading? Clearly, you see an opportunity, regardless of which way the currents are flowing. But why don't you kick us off? And I'm sure this will be a fun conversation.
Very good. Thanks for having me, Andrew. I think it's it's a long journey from where we started. I mean, if you think back to the 80s, when sort of China first opens up for business, it was a time period where, as sort of mostly pioneers at that point, it was sort of the MNCs were coming in, the people trading garments and whatnot. That was sort of the 80s time period, and sourcing, looking for cheap value. But they were mostly weirdos, like weirdos poking around the edges of what was going on in the world. And it wasn't really until the 90s that I think business started to really take off. The Tiananmen Square incident of '89 slowed people down, slowed the US business down quite a bit. But then in the sort of mid to late 90s, you start to see a surge of interest in China. China enters the WTO in 2003, and that sort of gives it sort of the stamp of approval that it's okay, it's a safe place to invest in a way. So the financial incentives were quite obvious, I think, in that first sort of turn of the century, and it was easy. It was just basically copy your business model and come to China. And so that initial love fest, I would say, was that 95 to maybe 2010 was the love fest. And I think the height of it was maybe the Olympics, where there was China's coming out party, where they were at the head of the table and they were demonstrating, how great their infrastructure is. Everybody's making money, everybody's happy. And I think it changes quite dramatically when we get into after the global financial crisis. The Chinese begin to
Wait, can I ask you, Francis, going back to this love fest days of the mid to late 90s and early 2000s and Olympics, if somebody wanted to set up a business in China at any size, did you have to be 51% owned by a Chinese partner? And did you have like SOEs and local sovereign wealth funds from municipalities involved? Like was it super government involved? And or could you just walk in and own 100% of your business and expect to keep it?
Well, in some industries, it's still controlled in terms of what the equity participation on the sides of the foreigners are concerned. So, for example, in the OE business for automobiles, it's still restricted, or they're just releasing the restrictions. Tesla was the first one just a few years ago.
Right. But I mean,
So,
Tesla's a real exception, though. I mean, you can't, it's hard
correct.
to compare yourself to Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, Elon Musk all the time. Um,
Yeah.
but typically, if you saw, Maglev Trains or any other automotive company enter China, what was the equity split in the good old days?
So the restrictions on equity participation would there were many, many different industries that were restricted for a long period of time and still are restricted. So alcohol, tobacco, and firearms maybe is a good way to think about it, although alcohol is pretty much open these days. But early on, it was 50-50 was really the benchmark, I would say. And then beginning around sort of with the entry into the WTO, there were certain requirements put on the Chinese in sort of opening up the market. And so you started to have trading companies open up, and I think it was probably around 2000 or something like that. And then the joint ventures began to disappear, I would say, around that same period. As soon as people could move away from the joint venture, they did, because the joke was that you were sleeping in the same bed, but you had different dreams. And that is pretty much what most joint ventures were, is that everyone had very, very different visions of the future. The foreigners who were coming in here wanted to sell to the Chinese, and the Chinese wanted technology. They wanted to create their own brands and kick the foreigners out. And I think people who understood that from the beginning and knew that this was a marriage of convenience and divorce was just around the corner, were fine and were not shocked when the competition began to really heat up, as the locals began to understand the technology better, to do things in a way that many of the foreigners, either for business values, ethics, FCPA requirements, couldn't do what the Chinese were doing. And so that's where it becomes much, much more competitive. In 2008, 2010, you start to see people moving away from China. But even during that period, the Chinese consumer starts to take off. And so that's where you get the growth of companies that have tremendous demand in China.
So when did you, so originally there was this arbitrage opportunity, labor arbitrage opportunity, right? So the cost of
Yeah,
keeping your factory in Chicago was very high compared to a tier three city, even in China.
right.
Um, did you start to see that notably slip? I mean, we certainly did in the software engineering. Like I had portfolio companies that would have payroll in Shenzhen, and then all
Yeah,
of a sudden those guys didn't look much cheaper than anything
yeah,
anymore. Like ironically, Hong Kong's much more expensive to live in, but a software engineer is far cheaper in Hong Kong.
yeah.
Not to mention the government help you get compared to say Shenzhen. But so there was labor arbitrage is going away, but then the consumer is actually spending and wants an iPhone and wants to wear Western brands.
Yeah.
When was
It,
that? When was that inflection point happening, or would you even see it that way?
um, you can use that as a metric for certain industries. And so, for example, you can go back to the sort of the garment industry, the furniture industry, and you can say that that labor arbitrage began to disappear probably about 15 years ago, at least for the
Hmm.
garment industry. And then for middle level management and above, one could argue that the labor arbitrage was never really there. That the middle management and above was probably more expensive in China than it was globally, even as early as the the 90s, if you were calculating an expat salary, particularly at that point. But the general labor arbitrage for, if you're just looking at the average worker on let's say on a shop floor, um, I think that that labor arbitrage still exists. Um, as far as productivity is concerned, particularly the application of capital equipment within China, the cost of capital equipment, the cost, the entire cost of the organization. There's still a cost arbitrage opportunity. Um, and particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, we're in a deflationary environment for labor, for certain parts of labor. Um, so it's in flux, I'd say, Andrew. It's still in flux.
Okay. And it felt to me in many of the meetings we were in and initiatives that we were starting, but did not get to a point of truly hitting go. Basically signed contracts and then they kept renegotiating the contract after it was signed, and we said that's enough for us. Was that it's pretty exciting if you can have like a government sovereign wealth fund from some municipality involved in your joint venture or something, and you've got like distribution lined up so that you can enter a market like China and hit the ground running, um, with a bunch of your ducks in a row. Did you see that happening? I mean, meaning that like capitalism is capitalism, but like you know the Western world is rather chaotic compared to a polarized marching in the same direction dynamic that can happen in China. Have you seen that over your decades?
Yeah, I think government support is a double-edged sword. It can quickly turn into something that doesn't work. Um, someone falls out of power. For example, like if you were in bed with Bo Xilai and his clique, and all of a sudden he becomes persona non grata.
Yeah,
Um, I mean that happens quite a bit. Um, so um, I as a rule tend to shy away from those types of um, reasons for getting an edge,
sure.
um, because I don't think, maybe that's my early experiences up in Tiananmen Square and dealing with the government up there, and understanding um, I mean I think one of the things to understand about China, it's a mafia state. And the easiest way to understand the CCP, is that they're the mafia, and they control what they want to control. And if, like anyone who's dealt with the mafia, if you deal with the mafia, you understand you're at their beck and call, right? Whatever they want is theirs. If they come in, when they came in and they took over Jack Ma's business, he just said, like any smart guy, he said, "Go take it. It's yours, right? It was yours from the beginning. I serve at your pleasure." And that's one of the reasons I think he's been able to keep his head.
Right. I mean, that's kind of the joke is what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you for the
Like
10%.
that's Putin's boat. You know, you're on the
Yeah,
boat today. If Putin wants the boat, it's his boat. So it's all his.
that's correct. And so the parts of China that I find that are much more easier from an entrepreneurial perspective are the ones that are far away from Beijing and their leaders, and outside of what they think is important. So it's the
And do
little
you feel the
stuff.
same way about all the different cities? I mean, every city seems to have its own mafia. So there's the CCP, and they
Yeah.
tell each city, we want you to do this buzzword, at least in the venture capital business. You know, we want you to do semiconductors, we want you to do e-commerce, we want you to be venture studio. They kind of seem to get their marching orders, and they've got these economic free trade zones. Like when Hong Kong was misbehaving or behaving badly,
Yeah.
there was something like 92% of all the current account money in and out of the country seemed to be flowing through Hong Kong. And that like fell from 92% to like 6. And now there's like 6, 7 different economic free trade zones in Nanjing alone.
Yeah.
And you know, the old southern capital. So it seemed like, you know, the one loophole wormhole for the country became like Swiss cheese kind of quickly.
Yeah.
But did you so I guess I'm saying a lot of confusing things here, but do you think of you sound like there's one mafia and that's Beijing. Isn't there kind of a local mafia in every major the provinces are competing with each other, the cities are competing with each other, and they have their local mafias and it's competitive. It's like a football pitch. These guys are playing a game.
Well, and this is I think one of the saving graces of China, and why it has performed so well, is that each province competes against each other, and they have certain directives from the central government, from the federal government, you can call it that. And each province has, basically GDP benchmarks is what they were mostly, and tax revenues, is what they were being judged on in the past, and they were all competing against each other, and there was also sort of the Olympics to climb up the corporate ladder, to get the big roles in Beijing, the federal roles. So yeah, it's like, I mean, the minor leagues are the third and fourth tier cities, and the major leagues are the provincial capitals, and then the World Cup is up in Beijing. I think you can think about it that way, from how these teams within the local parties compete with one another. And so yes, each region will have a political and social infrastructure, which you have to be attuned to, and understand. And that, some people, there are parts of China some people just won't do business in, because it's so rough and tumble. Shandong is known traditionally as a place that's just extremely difficult, um, because of the way that the party wants to control everything there.
Okay. And so you were walking us through history, and we got up to, I guess, the Olympics. China's in the WTO. The arbitrage opportunity is maybe changing or was never there for everybody, but cost of total capital when you consider CapEx and operating and maybe work ethic productivity. You know,
Yeah,
a Tesla worker probably makes more Teslas in China than they do in Texas.
yeah. I think, I'm not sure about that, but yes, I mean, the productivity levels are pretty high. Um, but it really depends on the industry. I mean, we did something in the bearings market recently where, one of the guys in the bearings factories here in China said to me, "Well, we're never going to be able to compete against the Germans still."
Wow.
So I think there are certain, there's certain black magic in certain industries that I think other nations will continue to lead. I think what's important, if we think as we roll through that history, is as you get into sort of the 2010s, China begins to think that it has the secret sauce, and they understand how to create the biggest economy in the world. And I think that the most interesting development over the last, I would say, 15 to 20 years has, I think about China almost like a young investment banker who's successful at JP Morgan, and then all of a sudden says, I'm going to go out and strike it on my
Oh
own.
yeah, I've seen
And they
this
go
many
out
times.
and they fail miserably, right? Because they forget about all the infrastructure that is around them.
Or just
And
having
I,
Goldman Sachs in your business card or JPM, and now you're just Bassolino Associates. You're missing that old bonus and getting your expenses comped. And people liked signing up to IBM, Goldman Sachs, JPM, Morgan Stanley.
well, and I think that there's also in China's case, and when I use this sort of metaphor, in China's case, it's they really thought that they had the secret sauce, that this state-directed capitalism was the way to go to the future. They're like this whole administration that they've brought in from Xi Jinping from 2012 to today, they're still buying into that, even though it's it's never been it's never worked. Like if we look historically, state-directed capitalism never works. And I think that the Chinese are beginning to realize that, the average person on the street is beginning to realize that. But the administration is still sort of balls to the wall with this strategy of, we're going to pick EVs, and then we're going to do AI, and then we're going to do biotech, and then but it's not working if you think about it. I mean, there's certain things that are working, but even in EVs, they've destroyed the market in terms of profitability. The operating margins of Tesla, I think, are like double or triple what they are at BYD. So it's to me, it's the real thing that I'm wondering about the future, and maybe we can get in this later, otherwise we'll get bogged down, but is what's at what point does the administration here realize that the path that they're on is a dead end?
Okay, but what about I mean I'm sort of brainwashed having grown up in the West to want to cheer you on with that. But I also look at California trying to build a maglev train from San Francisco to San Diego and paying billions per mile and then failing to deliver anything but losses and a non-working outcome. Whereas, we were talking about when I used to work with Jay Boyle, in China, we would blast right through a hotel and a restaurant to keep the fiber perfectly straight,
Yeah.
to build the optimal network. That I've been on a lot of maglev trains, and it changes. There's an accelerator that was 30 minutes outside of Shanghai that is now
Yeah.
important because you can just pop in a 30-minute train ride, do your email, or your even software engineering on the train. Whereas in the past, and before that train, it was like, forget that place. That's a dead zone. And environmentally, maglev trains are quite important. And China seems like they really pulled that off. And then nuclear power, especially with AI, with nuclear power, we can grow the human population to endless points, desalination and water and food growth and all these things. It seems like China is going to have a lower cost per kilowatt hour than anybody. And the United States is just killing itself with regulation from the 70s and legally corrupt politicians, Citizens United. So it's like, you just can't, they're going to have nuclear everywhere in China. They already have the maglev trains. And, we're going to be in the dark ages in the United States and Europe. Europe better than us, that, with the trains, and
Yeah.
better than us with nuclear.
Yeah.
But anyway, before we crucify the failed government-led capitalist system,
Yeah.
it seems like they got something right with their strongman way of getting stuff done.
I think yes. So, for example, I applaud the they basically killed pollution. Like pollution was a huge issue
Yeah.
15 years ago, and now the air is
Blue skies
really
in Beijing.
clean.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I remember taking photos of blue sky saying, look, some blue sky. I was here. It's like London. Let's all run out into the park. It's a beautiful day in June.
yeah,
Where now it seems like they've really killed it.
yeah. So I can point to a few examples that demonstrate, and I guess as you said, the infrastructure network around trains, airplanes, buses is really interesting. What they're doing right now in Wuhan, where they've just said, okay, the city's open for robot taxis, and like there's no one who's going to say, oh, but my dog got run over, so therefore legislation. Okay, so one dog gets killed or one woman crossing the street who looks like a tree gets hit in Arizona, and all of a sudden all bets are off, right? So they're gonna, a few people are gonna die in China at the due to robo disasters, but in the context of all these things, if you go back and you look at how entrepreneurship is, we talked about Jack Ma and the throning of Jack Ma, is that basically, China 15 years ago, with all the Alipay and the QR codes and the payment systems, like they were in the lead, right? In some ways. And now they're just, I don't think they're leading at all in that space in digital
Well, that
payments.
market cap has been completely decimated.
The market cap has been decimated. The company is an absolute disaster. All of the branch companies that are around it are not making money.
And I would argue it signals to if you're a young Zuck trying to be the next Bill Gates, and so you're the next entrepreneur from China, and you see Jack Ma get mugged in the streets like it's New York 1970s, keep some mugging cash in your pocket. I mean, maybe you're going to think twice about building your business and raising local venture capital funding. You might want to move to Singapore or get out.
That's what people are doing, right? So
Right.
they're setting up organizations in Singapore, and they're having sort of this plausible deniability that they're Chinese. Um, so I think that the most interesting thing for me is there a point at which we move off of state-directed capitalism as the direction, and what is the catalyst for that change? I don't. I think that the economy has been in free fall now for. I mean, if you take a look at the ideas of state-directed capitalism or the idea that Daddy knows best, the whole COVID response was it. They were like Eskimos. They learned to live in the Arctic, but then what? Like, so they learned to kill COVID, but like there was arrested development, right? There was no path beyond just keeping cities closed forever so that people don't die of COVID. But now people are, they're dying because of depression and all of these other reasons that they've really done, I would say, almost irreparable damage to the economy. And where we are right now is that the global business community, I think, has fallen out of love with China, and many of the Chinese are looking at this and saying, this is not who we are. They look at this idea of, sitting around the table with, I would almost call them a table of misfits, right? You have the Chinese, the Russians, the Koreans, the Iranians. I mean, they were hosting the head table in 2008, and now that they're hosting the table of misfits.
Yeah. What do you make of the Limitless Friendship contract and press release that happened like 4 days before Putin's invasion of Ukraine?
Um, I
Or how do people
I
even
think
think about that in China?
yeah, I think I think the average Chinese person is very suspect of the Russians. I mean, the Russians took more territory from the Chinese than I think anyone else did post World War II, and people remember that very vividly. although it doesn't talk about as much as sort of the Japanese problem. They fought a war. It's a marriage of convenience. And I think maybe the Chinese were playing the Russia card the way that the US were playing the China card back in the 70s. I think the US and China are more natural partners, much more natural partners than the Russians and the Chinese are.
But I mean, if
the
you're
Russians and the Chinese are more natural enemies.
if you're just your general sophisticated young woman, young guy in Shanghai, and you're watching a lot of movies and listening to a lot of music, and you're like, what are we doing in the North Korea Russian camp? Why don't we hang out with, I don't know, the French and the Brits, and I don't know,
Well,
where's the good
you
beach?
see
Where are the
it.
good beaches? Let's go there. Come on. Let's go to
Yeah,
Saint
you see
Tropez.
it in the humor, in the humor, Andrew. Like they make fun of North Korea all the time, and so I think that China has really done itself a disservice. It really does not have any friends geopolitically. It
What,
has some marriages of convenience.
what I want to talk about what the state of the internal economy is right now. You've already kind of led us there, but when the Trump tariffs were going up, and I was driving around in cars with some Chinese guy having conversations where you feel quite private, like they can really speak their minds. They were
Mm,
like, yeah, they kind of felt like we're too big to fail here,
mm,
and that it's the Americans that'll pay for a more expensive toothbrush that's manufactured somewhere in China. And it says made in China on so many things in your life in the West. They're like, good luck decoupling and go ahead and decouple. I just don't care. That felt like the answer from almost everybody I was dealing with. But that was a long time ago. I've not been to China since 2019.
okay.
I was there like right when Wuhan was blowing up. That was
Uh-huh.
my last time, and I haven't been back since. What's your view, or how bad is it, and what is their view of this decoupling that is clearly happening?
Well, decoupling is is a silly term for anyone who looks at supply chain problems. So you walk into Home Depot and not even so just take a drill, and open up the drill and see what's inside of it and think about all the little components that are in there and say, okay, where did all that stuff come from? And whether it's down to the plastic pellets that made the case or the mold that made the plastic pellets. I mean, there's the entire supply chain is so interwoven in the global economy that kind of when someone says, how's decoupling going, you can kind of say, well, they're obviously not in the supply chain. There's
If you
a
start ripping organs out of your body, you may see the whole thing fails.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's like dismembering your body. For particularly for the multinationals, the large multinationals. If you take a look at like the top 10,000 companies in the world, it's virtually impossible for them to disassociate themselves from the supply chain. So decoupling is like a dismemberment of the body. And in the sense of, particularly for the multinational corporations, the leading 10,000 companies that are out there in that touch the supply chain, everything that they do is going to somehow be connected to China. And for those with, let's say, a little bit better understanding, but still sort of a sophomoric understanding of what's happening in the supply chain, what we'll see is that if we look at the headline number, we'll see that Vietnam now is a much bigger trading partner with the United States. But that number is like 70% of it is inputs coming from China. So there's still it's almost impossible to completely decouple, except if you have a CFO who will say, okay, I'll take the 20% increase in price and I'll source it in Mexico, or I'll source it in Hungary, or I'll source it in Slovakia, whatever product that you're doing. So de-risking is probably more is the better way of thinking about it, and it's about basic supply chain 101, which is about having dual sources of supply, no geographic concentration in the supply chain, and very often that will be at an additional cost. And what we found is that most companies are really not that willing to take on the additional cost.
So even where we are right now, and we're recording this, and I'm in a summer location here in July of 2024. Do you see a slowing down of people willing to establish a new manufacturing facility in China, or have you seen like a complete pause to that? It's more of let's maintain what we've got, or are you seeing a massive flow into other places like India, Pakistan? People always talk about Vietnam as the place to put your what would have gone to China, now put it in Vietnam.
Yeah.
What do you see on new build versus maintain, or even get me out?
Yeah. So at the margin, I would say the majority of people are trying to have a China plus one strategy. So any incremental investment is going into having some type of supply chain that runs through Mexico, Vietnam, India, Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia. I think that Eastern Europe is probably, once things settle down in Ukraine, I think Eastern Europe will also have a bright future in terms of manufacturing locations, final points of assembly for product that still has a lot of inputs coming from China. A lot of the foreign direct investment has declined when you look at the macroeconomic numbers, but I'm not convinced that that indicates anything significant in terms of the long-term trends. The post-COVID what would I call it? The statistics on the post-COVID FDI numbers are way down. But
How much down? How much down are they?
They're probably off by 70-80%. I mean, they're way down.
And I always thought like going back to my early telecom days, that you used to get vendor financing from Lucent and Nortel to, build your fiber optic network and get all your switches and endpoints. And then you get subscriber revenue. And then once you have revenue, you have VCs investing equity, and these vendors lend you money to buy their stuff. And then you pay them monthly down like a mortgage with your subscriber business revenue. So build a telecom mobile network in Sweden and then eventually pay off Ericsson, kind of thing. After the dot-com crash and the end of the golden telecom gold rush, China was the only game in town. So you had like Huawei ZTE with China Development Bank would lend money to Huawei to sell gear in the UK. And it felt like the golden way to understand the Chinese was they want to bring real money, hard currency, US dollars, euros, Swedish kroner into the current account so they could buy things where no one wants the renminbi, yuan as a currency to sell their wheat or whatever, or all these inputs that are going into these factories. So the whole game was about, this is the borders of the People's Republic of China. We got to get real money into this country so that the current account grows, the bank account of the country. If the FTI is really stopping, direct foreign investment, that's a problem. It could be a big problem.
If the money is cheaper in China, then I would finance any growth with domestic capital. So the availability of capital to multinational corporations, and even not multinational corporations, it's readily available. So your average, young kid just graduated from Georgetown, working at a DC think tank, he's going to look at the econometrics and say, look, FDI is way down, China's screwed. But he doesn't know that money is free in China. So his analysis indicates nothing. Other than that, okay, the MNC is not taking capital from their US account, moving it across borders into China. But we don't know what those companies are actually doing in China with their businesses. And so when you look at the average multinational corporation today, call it Nike, call it Apple, 20-30% of their revenue is dependent upon China.
Yeah, I know. I always think of this, that like everyone's like, oh, you venture capitalists, meaning me, shouldn't be doing business with China. And I'm like, what percentage of Bill Gates' revenue is coming from China? Last time I looked, it was like 12%. What percentage of the revenue of the Fortune 500s doing business with China, where we're told to do nothing with China? And that doesn't quite seem fair. Maybe I don't donate enough money to my local American politicians.
Well, I think the American politicians, there's bipartisan agreement right now that China is the Antichrist. And so if you got nothing to say, you sort of look at the script and say, oh, China sucks, China's the evil empire. People clap. And so it signifies nothing really. I think we use as a benchmark, basically, we think that the average MNC probably should have somewhere between 10 and 30% of their revenues generating in China, and they should have somewhere between 20 to 40% of COGS coming through China in some way.
Okay, it's an interesting way of thinking of the health of your organization to self-actualize on the current arbitrage opportunity for COGS and revenue. That's interesting.
And then if you take a look at like the different brands, you can say, okay, I don't know, if you're Lululemon, what's the growth opportunity for Lululemon in China right now? It's phenomenal. And it's a question of distribution. It's a question of style, fit, sales acumen, and you can take a look. You go down all of your, the thing about what's the most interesting about what's happening in China right now is that it's kind of like the United States in the 70s, where all the money is funneling from so remember, if you can think about it like the Ohio Valley, or all the money that was generated during the boom in the United States from the 50s to the 70s, that money then funneled down into the cities and created all these rust belts. And that's what China is going to go through right now. So the bad part about it is the rust belts and all of the problems, the socio-economic problems for those people that are left behind. But the good part about it is that China, if current trends continue, will probably have about 600 million people living in about 90 cities, and they will consume at about where Korea consumes right now on a per capita basis. So,
and how does that benchmark to America or Europe?
It'll be half. I mean, on a GDP per capita basis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it'd be, sort of $30,000 versus the US is almost at like 70 now. But, in terms of disposable income, it's tremendous opportunity. And so, we can, what I find really funny about a lot of conversations with the VC world right now, coming out of North America, is that you start a conversation about China, and the first thing they talk about is these outlier events. They want to talk about Taiwan, the invasion of Taiwan. They want to talk about this relationship with Russia. They want to talk about how poorly the Uyghurs are getting treated, or how poorly the Hong Kong Chinese are getting treated. Like, and these are all they're important issues, but we're in the business of deploying risk capital, and if we look at this opportunity and say, okay, there's going to be 90 cities, there's 600 million consumers consuming at this rate, it's like Lululemon's just got to get, I don't know, 45 of those 90 cities right, and they 20% of their global revenue is coming from China. That's the opportunity.
When I saw the what is it, the Belt and Road Initiative? What is that?
Yeah, Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, and I see Saudis paying for or selling oil in exchange for renminbi. I thought that was an output of the cessation of cash coming in to the economy. I think that they export a lot of stuff, but they import a lot of stuff to make that, and so they're importing and exporting, and they get paid in dollars when they sell stuff, and so they have dollars to buy Saudi oil. But I thought that when I saw those headlines, and I don't see anyone in the press, so maybe I'm completely off with that, was that they were balancing the fact that they were missing direct foreign investment coming in on how many new initiatives are coming in from Germany or from outside every month. And COVID was crazy everywhere. It felt like China everywhere other than Sweden. And then they were trying to make up for it. They're trying to make up for it, which, it's an initiative to go for anyway, to avoid this one dominating reserve currency. But maybe that's not the case.
Yeah, I think the yuan trading is to me, it's, the Chinese would love to have a way to circumvent the dominance of the dollar, and particularly the risk associated with, if the United States gets angry with China for whatever reason, like they are with the Russians these days,
to weaponize the dollar. Yeah, it's very myopic to weaponize the dollar and then destroy the best golden goose you ever had with the reserve currency. In my view, but so
yes.
so you see a future of saying, look, you can be Lululemon and ignore 90 cities with a 600 million person population that are, could be buying your stuff, and point your finger at the Uyghurs and a blockade of Taiwan or whatever's going on, while Microsoft quietly is cranking away. I've been to their buildings in China,
Well, and I don't understand why people have to say that they're making some type of social value judgment by selling tight clothing in China. Like it's just, we're in the business of selling things, and I guess it's all caught up in I don't know. I guess I don't know how I deal with it necessarily on a political level.
Yeah.
But those things are generally, not part of shareholder capitalism.
Well, I guess, Francis, for you living in Shanghai and spending decades there, maybe you're not feeling it or seeing it as much as others, but why don't we use this as a segue into Taiwan? So, Xi sat down with Biden in the Fioli Gardens, like 10 minutes from where I used to live in Silicon Valley, and said, I'm going to annex Taiwan during my tenure. And he looks like a young lad compared to Biden, but he doesn't look that young compared to you and me. Meaning it's going to happen soon. If he, and he doesn't look like a guy who doesn't hold his promises there. I don't know. Maybe Lululemon doesn't want to increase their revenue and lower their COGS if the blockade happens, or even an invasion. What do you think is going to happen with Taiwan? And we'll just start there. What do you think is going to happen in Taiwan?
I think that invading an island is a very, very tall order. And that there is uh, there's a long and bloody history of amphibious invasions failing. China has an untested military. They haven't had any really active conflict since the Vietnam War in the late 60s, 60s or 70s. China is separated by 100 miles of water. There are only about 14 beaches in Taiwan that are accessible and where they could land. And they basically need to get 1 million soldiers across the straits in order to occupy Taiwan. Now, the blockade creates all kinds of problems from a military perspective. If you take a look at what the Ukrainians have been able to do to decimate the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, it's obvious that simple jet ski drones are very, very difficult to defend against. And Taiwan is much, much more sophisticated in terms of their capabilities to pump out drones. The US, again, is supporting them. The Japanese are supporting them. The Filipinos are supporting them.
And Chinese technology militarily has been, somewhat embargoed. And you could argue that they have employees in every single Google, and like the US and the West is infiltrated in a way. So it's not as simple to blockade military tech hitting China, but I don't know. My intuition says that Chinese military technology is not as good as they think it is.
And it's untested, right?
It's untested. And I have a feeling that like their military tech may not perform perfectly. But how would you envision the blockade working anyway? They just don't let anything airspace land in Taiwan. Could they pull that off and then just blockade anything from getting in, getting out?
I think it really depends upon the U.S. response in a lot of ways. The U.S. and the Japanese response to this. What do they do? The Japanese have a formidable military capability. We have bases, in Okinawa. I think the U.S. has been on a forward deployment of munitions for a while now. God knows what we've already given the Taiwanese that we haven't said publicly. So I don't know. Xi Jinping said recently that we're not stupid enough to get tricked into attacking Taiwan.
Oh, that's interesting positioning.
Yeah,
that's a saving face move if I ever saw one.
Yeah. So and I think that the Taiwanese have watched what's happened in Hong Kong, and they finally have sort of sat up and listened and said, okay, well, we got to defend ourselves. We don't want to be part of the mainland. So
that's clear. And I've spent time in Taipei myself and spoken to people, and yeah, it reminds me of talking to Israelis. They're like, yeah, Haifa rockets hitting the Intel factory. What are you gonna do? Let's go get lunch with our feet in the sand. And they're totally relaxed. I'm like, I'm not totally hip about this rocket thing in Haifa. Let's meet me in Herzliya. I don't even want to go there. Whereas the Taiwanese are like, oh, good luck with that. It's never going to happen. I'm like, then again, what else are you supposed to say? If you're going to fire Dan Quayle, you don't tell people until the minute you do. So you're saying then that an actual amphibious invasion of the way that rocky beach and mountainous terrain is not so simple to pull off. There's a huge question mark of what is the unified US, Japanese, and other power response. And it seemed to me like if he really wants to keep his word, he's going to do a blockade. And the blockade could be, again, completely depends on what's the response. That would be, people talk about, you see like European VCs saying, oh, let's all invest in green climate change venture capital funds in April of 2020 when the invasion happened. I'm like, hey, idiot, that's going to take 20 years to fix your problem with your oil. You get the
Right.
military putting solar out yesterday is what you should do, and get off of that Russian oil. But
Yeah.
my point is that we're going to feel a blockade pretty badly with, your head-up display is not going to work on your latest Ford pickup truck if there's a blockade of Taiwan. Like, you're not going to have the electronics for BMWs to work properly.
Yeah.
But it seemed like a blockade. I thought the blockade's just going to happen. You're thinking it's not.
I think that it's an act of war, and so it would make China a pariah state. So I don't understand what China gains
That's what
from
I've always thought. I've always thought I saw some charts that showed venture capital financings in Russia, year by year, or even quarter by quarter, or month by month, or something. And it showed how many had both a Russian VC and a Western VC in the same financing, right?
Yeah.
And then it showed the 2014 annexation invasion of Crimea, and it went to zero. The Western just went to a flat, off a cliff, zero. And then there was a couple of financings of Western only. With there was no Russian and Western financings, and you saw a couple of Western financings that were just ripping companies out. You
Yeah.
know, so I would think that the the ramifications and consequences of an invasion of Taiwan or a blockade of Taiwan would be so severe that if you saw Chinese rioting during COVID lockdowns, you might see the people say, you're not acting in the best interests of our country by doing that.
The only reason to do it is as a diversionary tactic because the domestic economy is so dysfunctional.
Okay, so it's a
And
wag the dog, we need a war to
yeah,
distract the people's little bread and circus and beer. And so maybe we've kind of covered that topic. Maybe uh, Western media is hard to trust right now, in my view, and that's why primary sources from someone who's in the inside like you is so exciting to me. What is the state of the economy, and like when you hear about these large real estate companies, and finally the toll is coming for these ghost towns or whatever, with real estate was driving a lot of things, and that's an issue. It's a post-COVID world. What is the current state of the economy, and is it a tale of 20 different cities, because China's a big place?
um, yes, it's very important to differentiate between what's going on in different regions. And so you have, the Northeast has been in a declining state for, I would say, 15 years. So we way up into the Northeast, sort of a Harbin or Liaoning, and even some parts of Shandong, and they haven't been doing well for decades. These regional centers there's some of them that are exploding. Like, I mean, Shenzhen is exploding. Xiamen, Chengdu, Wuhan is actually doing quite well. Changsha, Hefei, Shanghai has generally done fairly well, and that is, it's a bit like these cities have they're more than a one company town. They have, education, healthcare, government institutions, industry. So there are some cities, first tier cities, which I think will have resiliency. The real estate problem is tremendous. The amount of capital that went into building property that was basically for most people was seen as an investment that only had one direction, and that was up. And now for many third, fourth tier cities, that really has only one direction, and that is down. And so there are a lot of people who are sitting on assets which have no liquidity and declining value. And I don't know how they're going to manage that consumer sentiment. I would say, it's kind of going to the numbers that I was saying earlier. You may be talking about half the population, maybe sitting in a situation where they're declining equity position for their net personal assets. And then there are pockets of not only just hope, but like animal spirits. And EV is one that's sort of been hot these days. The consumer, some consumer spending areas I think are quite strong. It's sort of consumer hard goods. In some places, they're certainly not doing well over the last sort of 18 months. But if you look at them on a trend line over sort of 5 to 10 years, you can plot out and say, again, if I was saying, not to just keep on picking on Lululemon, but if any type of sort of exercise or lifestyle, Pernod Ricard just built a super premium whiskey distillery in China. They spent $150 million on the investment. The super premium whiskey category is growing by 50% per annum, and the bottles are selling for $120 a bottle. So like there's those markets for differentiated products have, I think, significant opportunity to capture that 600 million population who are making it. The problem is that urban youth unemployment, the general sentiment of the young generation right now is one of, lying flat is something I don't know if you've heard this term before, but it's become very popular here. It's like people just say, yeah, we got some real estate, we got some money in the bank. I don't want to go to do a job that's a sort of meaningless income with a meaningless future. I'm just gonna sit at home, play video games, not have children. So there's a lack of hope in the sort of the PTSD that we have from COVID. It's quite depressing.
Okay. And so what do you think the next couple of decades look like, and what do you expect to happen?
Yeah, so the Mercator Institute did a very good study on scenario planning for China, and they came up with 5 scenarios. There, 2 of them, the most probable outcome is one of shaky China, is what they call it, and this is basically China's muddling through. The current policies are not supporting a robust foundation for the economy. So they've given up on reform. The capital markets have been dysfunctional for a decade now. As I was saying, the employment opportunities for the youth are not good because the new business creation, general GDP growth, demographic decline, it all creates the situation where it's a very, very unstable future. And we have a political leadership right now which doesn't seem to have realized just how bad the economy is. And they come up with these policies because they think they know how to control everything. They're not letting the market. I mean, the beauty of what China did over the last 30 or 40 years is just letting the animal spirits of the Chinese free. So I think in the absence of reform, we're going to muddle through for a long time. And that the saving grace in a way is that there were a lot of smart things that were done over the last 30 years. So they can make a lot of mistakes for a long time before it becomes dystopian. Two other, I think, scenarios worth mentioning. One is that China could be successful. That they could have, maybe Xi Jinping is Lee Kuan Yew, and he really does have, the vision of the anointed, as Thomas Sowell would say. And if China is successful, and particularly if the West is unsuccessful, that people will gravitate towards China and the China future of sort of authoritarian leadership and daddy knows best. And, so it's almost in relative terms, right? If the West fails, if the United States has, if we start burning cities because we elect a Democrat and we wanted a Republican or vice versa, and that happens for a decade, and then China succeeds as the stable rock in the future, then that's a potential outcome as well. There's also Nicholas Lardy did a very interesting study, basically saying that China could return to 8 to 10% growth if they were to revitalize reform, and that's potential. Like they.
And Francis, can you give us some numbers, just for not everyone has been following this? What were annual growth rates of GDP in China over the last few decades, and how does that benchmark to US and Europe?
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about it, I think over the last that period from 1985 to 2012, I would say the average growth rate was probably 10%.
Yeah, and
Which
that's
means
Deng Xiaoping bringing a lot of people out of poverty, right?
Yeah, and it's the Chinese people bringing themselves out of poverty. Yeah, and
Okay,
it's and the
they're
government
hardworking. Yeah,
just staying the hell out of the way, pretty much. Um, and so
and
since
now it's fallen, but it's, yeah. Keep going.
yeah, so since about it's been declining, right? Because I mean, GDP growth is capital, labor, and productivity growth, and the demographics are such that the demographics have switched. So now it's getting very old very fast. The replacement rate on births is of the lowest in the world. Household formation is extremely low right now. So people are not getting married, they're not having children. So the GDP growth rates are down around 5%. Some people question whether that's actually the true number or not. Some people are talking about 2 to 3%. United States is growing at 2 to 3% right now. Yeah, so I mean, you go back to Lardy, and Lardy basically says you can get back to 8-10% growth if you continue to reform the economy. And what the current administration has locked onto, what you saw in the case of sort of telecommunications industry or also the tech industries, is they wanted to create duopolies in all of these industries, and duopolies that they could control. Yeah. And so they kind of thought they can control Alibaba and Tencent, but then Jack Ma got too big for his britches, so they had to lop his head off. And so this addiction to control is they're killing the golden goose.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Huawei had 3 CEOs, and one of them was a former general in the Red Army. So the idea of having deep packet inspection on your zeros and ones running through the West is kind of unappealing.
Yeah.
But maybe they thought they could do that with everybody. But the way entrepreneurship works, it's hard to do. I think that was the company that the China Development Bank built.
Yeah.
So there's a
Yeah, I
scenario
mean,
to get
so
back to 8, 9, 10% growth rates if there was political reform, essentially. How old is Chairman G?
he's about 72 or 73, I think, is about that. So
Okay.
yeah, and that's that's the thing, is that if if at least in the United States, we know that even if Joe Biden gets elected, he's going to be gone within 4 years, right? In
Right.
China,
Trump
this
is
guy,
running an ad saying you're electing Kamala, and then he makes her look bad. That's his latest ad. At least I was watching it on YouTube laughing.
yeah, that's he's got plenty of things to play with. I mean, he's got more than enough material. Even Jon Stewart is creating material for him these days.
Yeah, I know. It's good. Well, so anyway, so scenario, this other scenario is 8 to 10% growth with
Yeah,
some
and
reform
and
that
there's
could come
also
within the existing CCP, or there could be a change.
yeah, so there's another scenario where there's basically a revolt. There's a sort of a southern gang says you screwed it up, man. That's it, you're done. So
When you say
um,
a southern gang, do you mean like the Guangdong province, or kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
like,
Guangdong province has a sort of a Guangdong clique
yeah,
that is
like that Bay Area? I've heard people talk about it like the Bay. They call it the Bay Area. You've got like Macau, Guangdong, Hong Kong. I mean, there's a lot of
yeah,
Hong Kongers, man, that are like, hey, I got a place in Kensington, London. I don't need this action 12
yeah,
months of the year. I could see that happening. And what would that look like, though? I mean, it's scary to play games with Beijing, if you ask me, but what would that look like? It's like the
yeah.
lords have control of the economy and they're messing with the monarchy now.
I don't know. I mean, this is the thing about the CCP, is that we had sort of peaceful transitions of power um, since Deng, but you know, Mao's transition wasn't the whole Gang of Four. That took a while. You had the Cultural Revolution,
That
so
was
I
horrible.
mean, yeah, I mean, you had basically 15 years of chaos. Um, so if Xi Jinping actually believes all this nonsense about his brotherhood with Russia, and he really is smarter than everyone else, and he doesn't change his stewardship of the economy, then I think that we will we will begin to see more and more people vote with their feet. The people who have money will leave. The people who don't have
And I
money
think
will.
that's clearly underway. I mean, there was an exodus from Hong Kong to Vancouver with the handoff. And then there's been if you talk to anyone about their housing prices in Singapore recently, there's a drip of Russians coming in there, and Indonesians and Indians have always done, but the there's a Chinese invasion that's already happened in Singapore. And you even
Yeah,
touched on Mexico, of like Chinese are building factories in Mexico and buying property and saying, embargo, no embargo, I'll be importing to the US sensibly from Mexico. So voting with your feet is one is maybe
there's also a collection of people who are taking these visa-free trips to, like, I think Ecuador or something, and they're just walking into the US. The number of asylum seekers that are walking into the US across the southern border who are Chinese has increased dramatically over the last few years.
hmm.
So, there are a lot of people who are saying, I don't want this future for my children. Um, so uh, yeah, I think that they've not, it's not only the Westerners that have fallen out of love with China. I think a lot of the Chinese are falling out of love with the administration here, and that the basic deal was, you guys can control the politics as long as we have increasing quality of life. Um, and I think when your children don't really have a viable future, then that deal is it's done, right? It's over. So
Yeah. Yeah.
the
So if they're
gloves can
failing
come
to
off.
deliver their side of the bargain, you don't get to run around in your throne, Pope mobile anymore.
Right.
Are there other scenarios that you had left, or was that kind of the last one?
There's a confrontational China one. So there's one where there is the war. Um, and so
And I just can't see any good ending to that for China. I mean, they
I
just
see.
do business. I mean, how does that ever get justified?
Yeah, I see proxy wars as the most probable. Like if tomorrow someone gets shot in the Philippines, that wouldn't surprise me at all. And even if it was like a US military plane, a Chinese plane crash in the, South China Sea, I could see that stuff. And that could go off the rails, right? It could be our I don't know,
Well, that's the
start of
that's when people say we don't want to elect Kamala with Biden, is that she would have to prove herself of how tough she is, and it's kind of like Margaret Thatcher. Don't think women don't dig a good fancy old fashioned war, iron fisted lady, that I don't want to weigh in on any of that, but people
yeah,
are.
I don't know that it really matters that much. I think that like I said, the Democrats and the Republicans seem to be equally adamant that they would push back. Um, I yeah, I I don't even know enough about Kamala Harris. I mean, I don't think any of us do. Right?
Yeah,
It's
right,
just
sure. So,
untested.
so there's the combative scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
and that's sort of the final scenario of this analysis.
Yeah. That's about it. Where it's I think really worth mentioning. But I think the base case is shaky China, right? It's not as strong as it thinks it is, and there are all kinds of opportunities for us to deal with a shaky China, and sort of I think shaking them away from this relationship with the Russians would be one thing, or what a or sort of cutting off those relationships, let's say with the Iranians or something like that, to or the Brazilians, this whole idea of them being leaders of the global South. Um, these are things that I think are fairly big openings for the U.S. to counterpunch this idea of the rise of China. Um,
Okay. And Francis, why don't we close out on, you can't just, you probably don't want to retire and stop working. So what are the opportunities for business now? And what are the opportunities for business that you're seeing with Chinese moving out or Westerners coming in? Um, do you see opportunities for startups and venture capital? I think that people kind of said, all right, we're not going to do business with China for the next 10 years. And then that became the next 15 years. And that seems to be, I mean, if you run around Silicon Valley, this is what you'll hear. I would also say this, that, Y Combinator is now gone to virtual only, but with our team, we try not to miss a good demo day where you see, somebody's a batch of 30 companies pitching, a batch of 200 companies pitching over 2 days. And, around the 2012, 13, 14 timeframe, you start just seeing tons of people showing up, like some young child from China, like a 21-year-old saying, I have a fund to just invest in Y Combinator companies. And he's, writing 200K checks at anybody that would take it. Then people just kind of didn't want to take that money. You didn't want it on the cap table. It could be cancerous for your future financing. And now you don't see any Chinese. So like they're just not there anymore. Like I just don't see them in the demo days on the investor side. Um,
yeah,
so they look like they went home to some extent, or maybe they're buying real estate where it's less of a social relationship, kind of situation. Uh,
yeah. Well, China has become something that's not talked about in polite society. It has really become like a third rail issue. So many companies are looking for plausible deniability that either they're Chinese or if they're operating in China that they're American. It's easier to be a European company operating in China than it is to be an American company operating here. You're less of a lightning rod for any type of geopolitical thunderstorm. From a business opportunity perspective, I continue to see many opportunities in cost reduction and growth strategies. So if you peel back, and then this is less to do with the Silicon Valley tech thing, which gets all caught up in geopolitical strategy and warfare, right? It's what's the definite is it what kind of AI is actually has military applications. I mean that when you get sort of caught up in those conversations, like you're splitting hairs. And so I think that the opportunities are best focused on areas that are outside of these either politically charged or militarily connected, technology connected areas.
Right. So yoga pants is not really Kevlar. So that's an example, or luxury whiskey brands that capitalizing on that.
Right. And if you go back to the sort of luxury whiskey, super premium whiskey, the cognac that's being shipped from France has now gotten caught up in some geopolitical nonsense because the Chinese they're playing warfare with the trade. They're weaponizing trade and pushing back against the French because the French were talking about providing, I can't remember if it was support for Taiwan or whatever problem it was. They also did this to the Australians.
Yeah, the Australians really
blocking Australians' wines, Filipino bananas. But generally, so the Pernod Ricard guys, they set up this distillery in China, so it's basically a Chinese company. And so when they so that I think that all of these investments have to have some local presence, where so again, if you're selling to China, that you're not necessarily right at the with the American flag at the front door type of situation. I mean, they know probably. Consumers will be able to figure it out if they need to, but my base case is for those 600 million consumers consuming like Koreans are today. What do they want? And they're going to want everything that we want, from whether it's the the Ring doorbell or whatever it is that the US and Europeans are so good at creating all these differentiated products. I mean, for example, Brompton bicycles is a big hit in China. And who'd have thunk, right? A folding bicycle. The Chinese don't need it, but it's a fashion statement. And so it's these conspicuous consumption luxury goods is continues to perform quite well, even though it's a little bit of a lull. Tesla vehicles, right? You see that in that space as well. So on that consumer piece, you have that. I think tapping into the propensity for the Chinese to overinvest in capital intensive industries is another space that I also like a lot. So for example, they've built way too much oil refining capabilities. So there's all kinds of downstream products which the Chinese have an overcapacity of. And the Chinese, generally speaking, have a fairly unsophisticated distribution, branding, marketing, and sales infrastructure that can tap into global markets. And so building those types of distribution channels being the front end for commodity-like products or products that have become commodified due to overinvestment in capital equipment is another space that I really like. And
That's
so that
interesting.
could be,
It's like what's the capitalistic way to exploit the centrally planned Soviet style economy where they overbuilt, and we can come right in there and be like, this is a perishable, manufacturing capacity. It's like you got empty hotel rooms. We'll take a couple of them for less than they're worth. It's
so for
better than
example,
getting nothing.
in the tire industry, they've built way too much capacity for tires. Now the US has put tariffs, anti-dumping, so the US market is much more difficult. But if you could build tire distribution
Into
in,
India.
you
Yeah.
name the country, right? Or
Yeah, I know a big family that from Indonesia that makes the rubber. That could be, worth thinking about. That's interesting.
Yeah. So the Chinese have the money, they have the technology, but when you take them, you say, okay, let's go send a bunch of Chinese people to Brazil to go set up a distribution channel. They don't even want to go. They're not into it. They're very much homebodies in that way, and so they're interesting plays in, for example, the same thing in active pharmaceutical ingredients, generic medicines, medicines that are coming off patent. That again, those distribution channels outside of China due to this overcapacity in China creates opportunities.
I mean, in the West, there seems to be a really clear bad branding. You think of like the bad drugs that people in Africa have, that the medicine they're buying is not real. And you think of like, let's get off of Chinese manufactured pharmaceuticals completely. Like that's kind of like, it may be tough to decouple from sophisticated supply chain stuff, but I don't think Americans are looking like, this is not made in China. Good, I'll buy it when it comes to pharmaceuticals.
Yes, but the problem there, Andrew, is not that China can't make the pharmaceutical to spec. The problem is that the buyer didn't buy it at a price and sell it in a manner that was concerned about the integrity of their product in that market. They were just trying to make a quick buck.
Yeah.
And that sort of goes to the point of what I'm saying, is that this idea of brand building and trust between the customer and the brand, the Chinese are particularly bad at that.
Yep. So that's an opportunity.
That's an opportunity. Distribution, product development in North America and Europe is, and again, taking advantage of the low prices coming out of China.
Okay. And so, Francis, can you tell us anything on how people should contact you, and when people listening to this might want to contact you, and what your business is doing, where you're focused these days at Alaris?
Yeah, well, we'll put this in the notes. We'll just put a link to our webpage, and there'll be some contact information there. Our primary focus is on the middle market, mostly private equity backed companies that are looking for cost and growth opportunities, which are somehow connected to China. And as we were saying earlier, Andrew, I mean, I think that's almost every company has that opportunity. The question is do they want to leverage that opportunity or not?
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's really interesting. We'll make sure we get that in the show notes. So maybe we revisit this in a year and see how we're doing. I always enjoy our conversations, Francis. So thank you so much for bending the time zones and spending some time today. And I hope to see you soon one of these days.
Thank you for your time. I enjoyed it.
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.